Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another weekly installment of App Ideas and some fun programming, where we go through some cool examples of fun projects online, code them ourselves, and learn a couple things along the way. So, in today's video, I've learned a couple things from last week's video. I want to try and streamline it a little more, add some more organization, and see where we can go from there. So in similar fashion as last week, we're going to be continuing on with this repo here, App Ideas. I think it's a cool place for us to start and just explore and have a lot of fun with all of these different projects that are presented to us here. What I did today, I know last week I said I was going to start from the bottom and go up. I actually picked a random one from these just using Google's random number generator. And the one that I landed on was GitHub status. So let's go ahead and start off with the description of this project, and we'll go from there. So GitHub status. It says web apps require, or rather acquire, data in many ways. Through user input in web pages, through APIs to backend systems, from files and databases, and sometimes by scraping websites. The objective of the GitHub status app is to introduce you to one way to scrape information from another website. Let me actually zoom in a little bit here since I fear maybe it's not very clear for users watching via YouTube. GitHub status uses the npm request package to retrieve the current GitHub site status from the GitHub status webpage. The request package allows websites to be retrieved not to a browser window, but as a JSON document that can be readily accessed by your code. Although this application specification relies heavily on JavaScript, feel free to develop it using your language of choice. Then again, we have these similar user stories. So a user can see the current status for GitHub, Git operations, API request. Okay, so all the main operations of GitHub, all the main services. A user can retrieve the most recent status from the GitHub status website by clicking the Get Status button. And bonus features, user can see any of the GitHub components that are not in operational status, highlighted by different color, background animation, or any other technique to make it stand out. Use your imagination. Cool, so just to refresh everyone's memory here, so this is what the GitHub status site looks like. So essentially we will just be sort of recreating this. We'll just be doing some web scraping to actually get all this information, and then we'll just re-render it onto our own page with our own styling, so on and so forth. Cool. Again, gives us some useful links and resources. We'll go through that throughout the duration of the video. Anyway, so this time I think what I'd like to do is break it up into multiple sections. So let's say this first section is called the brief. Now we'll go into just a very simple HTML scaffold, and then we'll jump into some CSS, and finally we'll focus on the fun stuff, JavaScript. Really want to focus on those three big technologies, figure out how we can make a decent looking website that's functional, works, and it's to our standard. Cool, so I will see you on a little bit, and let's get started with the HTML for this project. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with our HTML. So as you can see from last week, I'm still using this very similar file structure. I just have projects, app ideas, and then tier one, so we can keep all of our tier one projects in here. I'm just going to go ahead and make a directory. I'll call this one, let's say, GitHub status. Seems like a good name to me. And then I'll just open that. Cool. So now we are in this new Visual Studio instance right here where we have our GitHub status project open. And before installing npm or anything, and because we just want to keep this really simple, just to HTML to begin with, let's just go ahead and create that index HTML file and let's start filling it out a little bit. So again, I'm going to be using this Emmet abbreviation we used last week. So just by me typing in an exclamation mark and clicking enter, I once again get this very nice HTML5 compliant scaffold, which allows me to build up my document very quickly. So I'll give it a title of GitHub status here, and let's go ahead and get started. So I think what I'd like to do is maybe create a grid, maybe make it, I don't know, 3 by 3. 3 by 3 seems like a pretty good grid to go off with, just to start off with at least. So let's see if we can do that. So Let's say we have our body area inside of here. Let's say we're going to have our section, and we'll call this section status. And then maybe each one of these will have its own box called status box. Now you can see I'm using this sort of naming scheme called BEM, block element modifier. So in this case, status is a block and box is an element of the status block. I like how BEM is constructed. It kind of gives your HTML and code some structure without having to do anything, with components like you would in like a single page application. It's kind of like the closest thing you can get to componentization of an application without using a framework. So I find it to be useful myself. But anyway, let's just go ahead and imagine what's going to be here. Maybe we'll start off with the name and just a paragraph to give the operational status. Again, I'll call this something like status box name, and then here status box status. Here, let's say this one's API requests. I think that's one of them. Let's say this is normal. Cool, so obviously none of this is styled, but we just want to see things coming up on the screen, making sure everything's working. I'm going to go ahead and reload my window here just to get my live server extension working. You can see here on the bottom right, it appeared there. So I'm going to go ahead and click live here. Opened up on port 5500. So let's go ahead and open that in the browser here. So let's come up here, open a new tab. Now you can see we have API requests and normal. So let's imagine now that we had, go back to our code here. Let's imagine that we had the 8 that we want. Or let's just make it 4 for now. I'm just gonna name these all the same for now, just for the sake of time. Let's go back to our browser just to see how things are looking now. Okay, so same thing, probably what you all expected. Nothing has changed drastically so far. Okay, so back in our code here, I think maybe I'd like probably maybe just like a header would be nice, right? So GitHub status. Let's go back to our browser. GitHub status, we get that nice header up here. Just some information to give to the user. And if I remember correctly, I don't know if it was a bonus or not, but to give a button to do a refresh. So let's go ahead and just add a button down here. We'll just give it a type of button for now. We'll say refresh. Let's go back to our browser. Okay, cool. Now we have our refresh button down there. So I think this is pretty much it for the HTML. I'm not really looking to create the most complex HTML document. Similarly to CSS, I'm not really looking to create something crazy, just something a little less bland. Last week we had a project that was very bland, so at least this week I'm looking to experiment a little more with that, get something a little prettier to look at. But really just focusing on the JavaScript. I think that's the most important part of this project. So I think this part will about wrap up the HTML. As far as the HTML elements go, we seem to have all that covered because we now have a header, we have our status, and at least in the beginning, maybe we just care to have the name and the operation, if it's normal or not normal, and then a button to refresh that. So what I think I might like to do as well, just to make it a little easier for us when we're actually creating all of these elements, is in similar fashion like I did last week, maybe create that template, and that way we can just copy off the template when we're using all of these. So let's go ahead and use that. So I'm going to create a template like I did last time. Again, I'll give this an ID of status template. And inside of one of these, I'll give status box. Now I can just remove the name and the status. So this will be our template for all subsequent status box elements. So really, I'll comment this up for now, but you can imagine that in our final HTML, we're not actually going to have these here. We're just going to have some entry points so that once we get that data from the GitHub status page, we can go ahead and render it onto our HTML here. Okay, so that about wraps up the HTML. So let's go ahead and move on to our CSS. All right, so continuing from where we left off, let's go ahead and start creating just a very basic CSS template to get things looking a little bit more organized. So as I was mentioning before, you may have noticed that I'm using this sort of naming convention. It's referred to as BEM, block element modifier. So in this case, our block is a status and our element is box. Cool. And it's the same for all these other ones. So box name is an element of status, and box status is a element of the status block. So what I'm going to do is first just show you all how I would organize this. So first off, let's go ahead and just create our index CSS instead of just bunching it in the root scope, with my index HTML. I'm just go ahead here and create a pages folder. So you can imagine all the different pages on your website will have their own CSS. Now this website's only going to have one page, so I'm just going to have one folder, rather one file. I'll call this one index CSS. And then I'll also create another folder here that I'll refer to as blocks. So blocks is going to contain all the different blocks that I have listed on my page. So let's just go ahead and start off with the status block. So because the status block is the main block, that's the only thing we actually need in this blocks folder. And actually, to keep things even more organized, we can go ahead and create another folder here called status, move the status CSS file into status folder. And now in index CSS, what we'll do is we can import that. So let's see, block status CSS. And now the pages, this index CSS file now handles, or rather it keeps track of all our different CSS imports. Makes it very clean. So now really in your index HTML, the only thing you need to use to link your CSS is just that one pages file. So pages index CSS. Okay, cool. So now our CSS file is linked. Not much has changed yet, of course, since we actually haven't added any CSS. But one thing I do want to make a quick note of is I think I'd like to have this centered. It's just something I'm very used to doing. I think with the way I have it set right now, it won't be hard to do, but I think it might be easier if I wrap this content around in some other div. So I'm going to go ahead and do just that. So I'll create a new div called content, and I'll use this as just a wrapper to center all of this content inside. Remember, the template we can leave outside since it's not something that's actually rendered onto the screen. It's just something that will help us out with our JavaScript later. Cool, so now we have this content wrapper, which because it is a new block, why don't we go ahead and create a block folder for that. We'll call that content.css. And then of course in index CSS, we can go ahead and import that here. So exactly the same as we did before. Let's go ahead and import content CSS. So now we have our basic file structure set up with our relevant folders, everything inside of index CSS ready for us to go. So let's go ahead and get started. Again, let me just show you what the browser view looks like right now. Again, nothing out of this world. It really is just the same thing. So let's see how we can start getting all of this centered onto the screen. So I think the first thing I'm going to do is let me go ahead into my content folder. Actually, even apart from that, why don't we create, because I might have to give some styles to body, so I'm even going to give my class a body of page. Okay, I'm going to give my class a body of page. Again, we'll create a new block folder here, call it page. Again, page.css. Now, this is going to be a little tedious at first, but it does pay dividends the more you get used to it and the more that you keep doing it. It'll just make your life a lot easier as you are developing, especially if you're developing with other people and your code is starting to become more complex. So now in page CSS, why don't we select that element and see what we can do. I want to remove the margin on the body. I also want to give it a height of the viewport. So let's see what this just does alone. It's not going to do anything, but at least we can open up the developer tools here and start inspecting the page and see. Okay, now we have this nice full height. I still see there's some space on the other side here. It's coming from this H1 up here due to the margin on the top. We'll work with that as we keep going. Okay, let's go back to our code here, see what we can do. Okay, so I have page in here now. I'm also going to make this a flex box. That way I can actually center my content by giving it a margin of auto. We go to here, let's do content. Let's give this a margin of auto. And this should give us what we're looking for here. Okay, so now you can see that this content is now centered. Let's just go ahead and look at this a little bit. So you have div class content, which is a little slim right now. Obviously want it to be a little wider than that, which I think I can do. Let me go ahead and add some percentage-based width to that. So let's say I want it to be, I don't know, 80% as wide as its parent. Okay, go back to our browser. So we look here, this box is still centered, but now since we've actually increased that width, the positioning of the content inside of it has changed a bit, but the content box itself is still centered. So that's a good place for us to start. Okay, so I think now the second thing that I want to do is I'd like to add probably some grid styling to these individual elements so I can get that grid look that I've been wanting. I think it's a nice way for us to style this, and at least it comes baked into the browser, so it's really nice for our use case here. So the area that I want with grid would be status. So let's say inside of here we have status. Let's give it a display of grid. Now a display of grid alone won't do anything. We actually have to say how we want that grid to look. So there's a shorthand property for grid, which if I remember correctly, it does rows first followed by columns. So I want an auto rows, and then let's say I want 3 columns. So one of the cool things is we can use this repeat function, and we can say I want to repeat it 3 times, and I want fractional units. So fractional units are nice because they automatically account for the width of each individual cell. It makes it a lot easier for us to use the grid, and it makes it a lot more responsive just out of the box. Always good to use these tools that come baked into the browser for us. A lot of times it makes your life a lot easier. So going back to the browser, we can see that we're starting to get a little bit of this grid look, which is nice. So let's go back here. Now you can see we have these grid outlines. I think something that I would like is maybe for each one of these status boxes to have like their content aligned. Now, if you don't already know, you can actually do these in the browser and test things out before actually implementing them. So I'm going to come and click on one of these status boxes, and down here in the styles pane, I can actually set my own style. So let's do something like text align center. Now you can see the effect that took, and you can toggle this checkbox to see it for yourself in real time. So I know this is on status box, so let's go back and figure out how we can do that. Okay, now status box is not actually a block, it's an element. So inside of our code, how do we actually make our code reflect that? Well, we would actually just create another folder and give it the exact same naming scheme. So underscore underscore box. I know this may seem weird, but again, it helps us just organize our code from the get-go. We'll give it status box.css name. We'll select it here, call it center. Now in status, what we can do, how do we actually make our code aware of that? Well, we can actually import it here. Box status box.css. And we don't even have to update index.css because index.css imports the root status, and the root status imports the box status. So let's go back to our browser. And now you can see we have these nice center aligned text fields inside of each one of our different boxes. Now, just to make things a little more clear, let's go ahead and give each one of these status boxes maybe a border. So I'm going to do the same thing I was doing before here. Let's say I want a border one pixel solid black. So let's go ahead and try that out. Go back to our code here. Do border solid black. Okay, now you can see we have everything's very tight right here. So why don't we give it a gap between all these different cells? We can actually achieve that with a property called gap, and we'll use it on the status where we actually created the grid. Now here, I'm going to give this a size of 2 rem. So for all you not familiar with rem units are just um, units that make your page a little more responsive because they are derived from the root element of your website. So you may have also seen M. Now M is similar, except it looks at these at its nearest ancestors element to figure out what the size should be. As far as I know, I think across browsers the default rem is 16 pixels. So if you do 2 rem, it actually becomes 32 pixels, so on and so forth. So we'll start with 2 rem and let's see what that gives us. Okay, nice. Now you can see we have these nice gaps in between all of our different cells. Let's see if maybe we can give a little more margin top to this button just to make things a little clearer. So very similarly, let's come back to this down here. Let's give this a class of refresh. No, say class refresh. And if you were guessing we'd have to create a new block, you are right. I'm going to call this refresh.css, and here I'll just target refresh. I'm going to give this a margin top of 20 pixels. No, I'm sorry, not 20 pixels, 2 rem to be consistent with the rest of our sizing. And then, of course, inside of index.css, we'll have to import that new block, refresh. Oh, can't forget the actual file. Come back to our browser, and you can see that now we have refresh nicely put there. So this by no means is something crazy. Again, it's very simple styling, but at least it just helps us present the information a little bit nicer than we did last week, and it just presents us some cool techniques that we can use for future websites. And who knows, based on your feedback, if you guys want something a little more extravagant, if you guys just rather focus on the JavaScript, please let me know, and I'll be happy to accommodate that. Okay, so now let's move on to the next part, the JavaScript, the fun part. See you all in a bit. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with the server-side JavaScript. I'm going to split this next section into two separate sections. The first one consisting of the server-side JavaScript, and then finally we'll be wrapping it up with client-side JavaScript and maybe some bonus things at the end. So to start off with, I'd like to split up my file structure just so that it more closely aligns with the classic client and server file structure. So what I'll do is I'll create a public folder here that will contain a listing of all my different public assets. And actually for now, let me go ahead and remove this node modules folders here. That was a lingering folder from a previous experiment. So I now have this public folder here, and we should be able to just move all of these into there. Sweet. And close this out. And let's go ahead and create our server folder with a single app.js file. Now, because we'll need some new dependencies like Express, which will be our backend Node.js web framework, we'll need to initialize this folder with npm. I'll use the -y flag just so that I can say yes to all the questions npm would normally prompt me for, as they're not really relevant at this moment. Inside of my package.json, I'll go ahead and remove the main key since I don't really intend to have an entry point here. And just to prevent any sort of publishing, I'll also set the private key to true. All right, so let's go ahead and install our first dependency, which is going to be Express. And let's go ahead and start using it. So on our backend, let's just first create a simple Express backend that can serve up our already existing client-side app. Since we're no longer going to be using live server and we'll need to do all the logic back here, we'll make it so that we can actually serve that index.html file ourselves through the Express app. So let's go ahead and create an Express constant, set it equal to the Express package here. Our app will now be an instance of Express. Of course, we'll need to listen to requests. Let's make it on port 3000. And then I'll just add this console log here just so that we know we're listening for requests. Now I want to use this public folder as my static folder. So for that, I can use the express.static middleware, but I'll also need to use the path module for Node itself. That way I can resolve paths independent of what operating system I'm in. That's why you might see path being used a lot in Express applications. So we'll require path. Something else I also want to note is you might see a lot of times that I alphabetize things or order things in a specific way. In this case, I'm having a section for native modules i.e. modules that come from node like Path versus third-party packages like Express. So inside of, rather underneath app, we'll now use this express static middleware. So express.static. Now we'll use path.join starting at this directory. We'll go one back, then we'll go and say set public equal to that static directory. So now we can simply do a node server app.js. We get that output listening here, and back in browser land, I haven't actually refreshed the page here, but if we come here, now we see that we're using localhost 3000 to serve up that client-side app that we already had prior. Okay, so the first thing we'll need to do is we'll need to create some endpoint on our Express app. That way the front end can communicate with it and get the status of the GitHub status page. So to do that, and underneath our middleware here, we can define a new endpoint. Now, app exposes all these different methods that you can use that correspond to different HTTP verbs. In our case, for example, they have like put, they have post, but here we want to get. I want to scope it just to get, and we'll give it a name of status as that seems most appropriate. Here, I don't think we care so much about the request, definitely about the response. So let's start off with this and think about what it is that we need to do next. So in this application, we'll be using a web scraping package called Cheerio, and Cheerio relies on there being some HTML to load. But in order for us to get that HTML, we'll actually need to make another request to GitHub status on our backend, and then with the HTML that we get back, we can pass that to Cheerio so that it can load it, and after this, we can start looking for our different elements and traversing the DOM. So if you all remember from last week, I used a package called Fin, and I found Fin from Bundlephobia. If you guys aren't aware of Bundlephobia, it pretty much just tells you the size of different NPM packages in your application. This is just to keep things lean. Of course, sometimes very lean packages come with some drawbacks. They might not be as feature complete as some of their counterparts, but it really just depends on what you need. So last week when I looked for Fin, everything was cool. Now this week I just want to use node fetch because window.fetch is already native to the browser. Node fetch, like it says here, is just a lightweight module that brings window.fetch to Node.js, and it's a similar size, so we're not really losing anything by using it. So I'll just go on their GitHub page here, scroll down, just so we can quickly see how we can install it. I'm just going to go ahead and copy that, go back to VS Code, cancel this process, go ahead and install node fetch. And I think they even give us a very nice example of how to use it, of course, once we require it. So let's go ahead. We're using the CommonJS resolution system. So let's go ahead and do that. Again, this is a third-party package. I'll put it right after Express just to keep things alphabetized. And here, okay, common usage. So it's cool because it's already GitHub. So I mean, we just have to use status instead. This is using async await syntax, which means that we'll need to mark our Express handler as async. Oh, wrong place. Instead of github.com, we'll need to get GitHub status. I'm actually going back to the browser. Just didn't switch scenes because it was just for me to grab URL. Cool, so let's see what we're doing. Now we have our response that comes from fetching this githubstatus.com, and then we get the body from awaiting response.txt. So now body contains the HTML that we'll use to load into our web scraper. So a very popular web scraper, one that I've used in the past, is called Cheerio. You can see that I've already looked it up here. 6 million or so weekly downloads, so you know it's good. Again, let's just go ahead and install it. Go back to VS Code. And if you guessed that I was going to put this on top of Express, then you are correct. I'm going to require Cheerio. All right, so now let's see how we can start using this. So the first thing we'll need to do is create a new variable. Now, Cheerio is sort of like jQuery on the server, and since jQuery normally, the way that jQuery is exposed and the way that most developers use it is with this $sign. So we're going to use the same thing here. We're going to set this to Cheerio.load body. So remember, the body is what we got. It's the HTML that we got from this response.txt, and now we're going to load that into Cheerio. Okay, cool. Now that we've loaded it up, let's go ahead back to our browser. Let's go back on githubstatus.com and let's look at what we're going to need. And of course, you saw I already had the DevTools open there again from a previous experiment. But we know we're going to need all of these different boxes here, right? So let's just hover over one of these. Already I can tell probably the thing I want to select for is this component container border color. But before we continue, I want to show you something that's very interesting. If we look at the DOM that's here, you might think that, okay, I'll need to get the name, so get operations, I'll need to get the status message as normal. The thing you have to understand, however, and I only figured this out after experimenting on my own, is that the status message span comes after the initial index HTML has been loaded. You can imagine that this is dynamic, and it's only after GitHub itself has pinged all of its microservices for their health would this be dynamically appended to the HTML. So if you're looking at just the raw HTML, for example, if we go to our network tab, let's clear all this out. Let's make a new request here. We can click on this first GitHub status request. That will give us back that HTML. If we come here and look for the same thing, I think it was components container. Start looking for something that's good for us here. Here we go, component container border color. You can see that we do have the name get operations, but we don't have a message, right? It ends right here at the tool icon indicator. So in this case, we'll have to find component status. And actually, if you try to find status message using Cheerio, you'll just get an undefined because it doesn't actually exist, which I thought that was pretty interesting. It kind of gives you an idea of how these pages are dynamic. And really what you're getting here is just the initial HTML required to be able to bootstrap the app. That's why a lot of times if you look at the page source for a React app or an Angular app, it's very minimal HTML because the JavaScript, the dynamicity, I suppose, is handling the rest. Okay, so back in VS Code land, let's see, we know that we want to look for, I think it was component container border color. So now the same way that you might select something with jQuery, we'll do the same thing here. So let's say component container and then the other class of border color. Cool. And then for each one of these, let's see, this accepts a callback with an index and an element. So index and element here. All right. So let's go ahead and do for our name, I'll say name field equals element dot find name. And we want the text of that. Then I'll just copy this. It's going to be similar for our status. So say element, and here we want to do component status. I just realized that I have to give this a class selector. Else that would just try to find a tag with the name, which doesn't actually exist. All right, so this should give us the tag of that. And I think so that I can actually, once I respond, oh, look at this, I actually have to move this on top. Before I actually respond with anything using the response variable up here, I think I want to make my own map. So let's do status map, and I'll make this an array so I can just respond with that. And inside of here, I'll say status map dot push, and here I'll do name field, and status field. And then let's go ahead and console.log the status map here and see what this looks like. So again, let's just run the server app.js. I'm not going to switch to the browser as I'm just executing a GET request on that /status endpoint. Okay, cool. So let's check out what we have. So now we do have this status map array with all these different objects. One of the first things we see that definitely doesn't look nice is each one of these name and status fields has this new line and a ton of white space. So if you're familiar with JavaScript and different string operations, you know that one of them that will come in very handy here is trim. So I think for each one of these, I'll do a trim. Oh, let's go. Let's kill this. Start it again. Nice. Now you can see the request. I started the server back so fast. The request didn't terminate. It was still there. So we actually got back the response immediately. All right. So everything looks good. The only thing is we have this rogue, not rogue, but this other object here, which you can't really see, at least not with the naked eye on the UI of GitHub status. I suppose it's for web scrapers like us, it might just be saying, hey, visit the actual website for more information. So we don't really want that. So I think what I'll do is right after I create my status map, well, why don't we just filter that one out? So we can do filter every status, status, say the status dot name includes visit. Okay, let's see what that gives us. Perfect, awesome. Then we can actually use this for our response. So respond back with a 200 and JSON with status map. Close this, start it again. Now our backend's listening. Let's go back to our browser here. And before I even had a chance to refresh, you can see that now this endpoint gives us this JSON object that has one key of status and an array of the status of all the different GitHub microservices. Cool. And of course, we can go back to our home and get our client-side app. And now we have this cool backend endpoint that we can just get this information from. All right, so that concludes the section of the server-side JavaScript. And now we'll follow up with the client-side JavaScript. Okay, now that we have our server-side JavaScript done, let's wrap it up with our client-side JavaScript. So let's move away from this app.js here. Let's go back to our public folder here. Inside of here, we'll create a scripts folder. Call this script index.js. The same that I've been calling all these other things like pages, index, CSS. I'll call scripts index.js. And then inside of here, I'll actually put this in the head section. Then what I'll do is I'll defer it so it only gets loaded once the other parts of the web page have been loaded up for us already. All right, so what do we have to do here? Let's first remove all of this HTML since we know we're no longer going to need this. It's actually going to be something that our JavaScript will handle for us. We know that when the page loads, we want to now call our new endpoint, get the JSON, and then do something with it. So let's go ahead and just do that first part. We know that we can use fetch. So why don't we just simply, let's go back to the browser real quick if we need a quick refresher on how to use the fetch API. Go to using fetch here. This example here will suffice. Default method used is get. So that's awesome. So back in VS Code, I simply just copied that there. I'll use HTTP localhost 3000 / status response.json data console log data. It seems like the perfect thing that we need right now. We loaded up our script. We have this fetch, consoling it out, logging it out via console log. So let's see what that does for us. Let's go back to browser land. Let's go back here. Perfect. Now look at this. So now we do have this status array here. Right? So status, the key, which has an array, and it contains all these different things that we want. So that's very, very neat. Now, how can we make this a reality now? Now, since I know that we will need to, for example, when we click on the button, I'll need to make the same request again. I'm going to go ahead and create a function for this. So let's say, not there. Say here, we'll say function fetch status. Put this in here. We'll have this done once, right when the app starts the first time. Now inside of here is we'll want to do all of our processing. So what is it that we need to do? So we know we have this template inside of our HTML. So let me first get a reference to this template. I'll go ahead and create a variable up here. I'll call this const status template. That will be document query selector. We'll use the ID selector. I believe I called it status template. Status underscore template, of course. And then we want to get the content of that template. Okay, and then to get the let's say status template element. I want to say status template dot clone node true. Perfect. Actually, why don't we just keep keep the code close to where it needs to be used. Perfect. So inside of here we have clone node true. All right. Maybe actually here we can say status template clone. And now let's say const status template element equals status template clone query selector. And we'll go back here and get our status box. Awesome. Now what is it that we have in here? We have our status box name and status box status. So let me get a reference to both of these. Say status box name, status template element dot query selector, and status box status. Of course, this one will be different. This will be status here. All right, so let's think about what we have here so far. Now, the data is an array, so it's okay that this is happening, but we don't want this to happen just once. We need it to happen every single time we go through this. So let's say here, this is data. We know that's going to be an array. So let's say data for each. I don't really want to use data, but let's say status item. Let's go ahead and copy all this here. Now, status item has, if we go back to our browser, status item has a name and a status, just to make sure we don't forget. Okay, so let's say here, status box name dot text content equals status item dot name, and status box status dot text content equals status item dot status. All right. Okay, now that we've actually created this element, right? So everything's based off the status template element here. Now we have to find a place to stick that element, which we know it's going to exist in status here. So here, top level, I'll create something like a status wrapper. Set that equal to status. And at the end here, in status wrapper, let's say append status template elements. So let's see what we've done here. We immediately call fetch status. We call our new endpoint with respond.json. We're getting this array for each one of these different status items. We're going to be getting the content of our template, cloning the node, looking for our status box, then setting name and status according to the information we get from the backend, and appending that to status wrapper, which is already in the style that we'd like, which is our grid. So let's go back to browser land here. Shouldn't need to start the server since nothing has changed there. Let's go ahead and see what's happening here. So we already see here it says data for each is not a function. Let's see why that's the case. We can use our handy dandy debugger here. Let's do another refresh. All right, so it's the status that comes back from there. So let's actually go back to our code. Let's make this so it's data.status.forEach. Let's go back to our browser. All right, let's refresh. Now we have data.status, which is our array. Oh, there you go. So now if we refresh this, you can see that now we have been able to dynamically load in all these different status from the GitHub status webpage. So that pretty much completes the application, but now we need to figure out how to do this refresh button down here. So let's make that actually happen. So when we click on refresh, we want to essentially re-execute that fetch status function that we've already created. Let's go back to our code, and let's go ahead and add a new event listener for that button. So we know it has a class of refresh. So let's say refresh button, document query selector, refresh. And here we'll say refresh.add event listener on click. We want to say fetch status. Okay. So let's go back to our code here. Not our code, but the browser. Let's look at some stuff here. Okay, so you see that when we come here, make that initial request to status, and when we come here, we also make that initial request to status. Now, we can see that instead of removing the previous code, we've actually added more to the grid. So we need to make sure that before we append anything, we also remove whatever was there previously. So I think for us to do that, let's see, one of the best ways we can do remove. So if we go to remove instead of just child, yeah, so the child node remove method removes the object from the tree it belongs to. That could be good. I'm not sure I want to remove end nodes. Is there a way to just, well, is there a method that will just remove all children? Let's see, so remove all children JavaScript. Clearing inner HTML. I suppose we could do that. Clearing text content, looping to remove every last child. So it looks like maybe just using inner HTML is the way to go, because that will actually manipulate the inner HTML, the element that we're operating on. So if we go back to our code, why don't we make it so that, let's see, when we get the data back, let's say that the status wrapper dot inner HTML is this. Let's see what that does. Go back to our code, refresh. So it looks like, of course, there's going to be that delay there. Interestingly, this it didn't look like it cleared anything out. But let's go back and see. Let's go back to our code. Status wrapper, right? Okay, so it does actually clear it. However, it just happened so fast we didn't even get a chance to see it. All right, so that looks like that covers pretty much the intent of the application. Just as a quick summary, what we did was we first created a very basic HTML5 compliant structure. We then used some basic CSS to get ourselves a grid look with some spacing in between just to make things a little more presentable. And then finally, we created server-side and client-side JavaScript to be able to scrape the GitHub status web page, make a request to it, and then scrape it, and then finally render that information onto our client-side app. I think I'll go ahead and do some maybe just follow-up bonus things to make it even more presentable. So give me one moment. Last but not least, let's just add some quick quality of life improvements just to make the user experience slightly better. So most of the time when you're working with applications that are fetching data from a server or a database or doing any sort of I/O, you want to let the user know that something is happening. Because if we look at how the website works right now, that split second where there is no data can lead users to believe that your app is not working as intended, even though you as a developer, you say, oh, of course it's working, but you maybe just forgot to put some indication of some processing happening in the background. So let's go ahead and focus on that first. So instead of using a normal spinner sort of animation, I'll just get a GIF with waiting. Now I use this one because I love The Office and Stanley is hilarious. So let's just go ahead and copy the GIF link. go back to our code here, and just for now, I'm just going to stick it in here. Image source. Don't need source sets, and we'll say Stanley from the office waiting. All right, let's go back to our application. Come here, and we have a big picture of Stanley waiting. Now, of course, we don't want this to always show up. We only want it to show up at the moment that we are waiting for data to arrive, and of course, we only want this to show up when the data is already there. And I think with the refresh button too. So knowing that, let's see what we can do. In order to make this easier for us, we can create a helper CSS class that will manage that display rule. So we'll need to create in BEM what's known as a key value CSS style. So we'll still have to create our block. So I'll call this display, but I'll give the file a name like, actually, just to create in our folder here, we can create type hidden. And here we do display type. So this is actually our key and the value is hidden. So now we can have other ones like display type visible, display type obscured, so on and so forth, whatever you want. And for this, we'll say that display type hidden has a display of none. And inside of display, we'll create display.css. And display.css will actually import that since it belongs to itself. And something that I learned already through experimentation is because we already have display being set on status, if I actually alphabetize this, the display will be set to none first, but then status will override it. So we'll actually need to import it afterwards. That way the style comes after. And this is just from the nature of how CSS works. It's cascading nature. So here we just need display.css. Okay, cool. So what do we need to make happen here? Let's go back to index.js here. Now, anytime I click on fetch status, I need to essentially add that style to both my refresh and status wrapper. So I think, let's see what we can do here. What's a nice way of doing this? Maybe I'll create a function called toggle visibility. And I can say that if the class is not already present, it means that we are looking at this for the first time. I only really need to check one since they both work together. So let's say if the class list of refresh button contains display type hidden, I'll say that if it does not contain it, it means that this is the first time, right? Because just like the raw HTML doesn't have the class. And well, what are we going to do? We're going to add the class. Let's just copy it here. And then we'll return here. And then similarly, if it does have it, so this is after when we already have the data, we'll do the same thing, but just remove it. And then we'll have to call this function every single time we call fetch status. And then once we get our data back, let's call it here. Let's see how this works. Start the server back up again. Let's go back to our browser. Okay, cool, nice. And when we click refresh, okay, same thing. So now, of course, we want to get rid of Stanley. So we can essentially do the same thing, but here it'll just be the opposite, right? Because when so the first toggle visibility comes and it doesn't have it, so we do want to hide it, but then we actually want to remove it, right? Let's let's get a reference to this here. Let me just give this some more lines to make it easier for us to work with. So let's call this here. This is status or loading image. Oh, we can call it loading. Let's just say const loading document query selector loading. So when we don't have display type hidden, it means that we're hiding. So at this point, we actually want to remove it, at least for Stanley, right? Because when we remove it, it's when we want to, no, well, I guess let's just go for it and see what happens. If we do loading loading.classlist.add, then here loading.classlist.remove, seems, yeah, of course, we need to have the opposite here. So you can see I just added the opposite there on lines 34 and 40. So back in our browser, perfect. All right, cool. So now we have this, at least some indication that something's happening. You see Stanley comes up, we say, hey, we're waiting. Data comes up, and that's good. And then just to make things a little more interactive, let's see, why don't we, I know it said it wanted us to do, for if it's operational, make it clear that it's operational. So what if we give each one of these, let's see, if we go in our code, status name, status, let's go back to our status block here, status box. So border 1px solid black. What if we make the border top something like 4px solid green? See how that looks. All right, just like a slight more color just to show that this is operational. It's just maybe a nicer way of looking at it. Let's go back to our code here. And let's say that since this is already status box, what if we also did, maybe we can just change this directly here. Status box status box template element. What if we said if status item dot status not equal to operational, then let's set the status template element. This time we're just going to do it directly here. So style, let's do border. I think here this will have to be camel case if I remember correctly, and we can set this to 4px solid red. And actually, let's just make it this just to test it out real quick and see what that actually looks like. Okay, cool. So now this is indeed red. So let's go back and keep that how we had it before. So now we can at least change it to be red if any of these are ever non-operational. And then finally, I think I'd like to add some effects to the status box itself. So let's say something like status box hover. Let's make the cursor a pointer. And let's transform it and just scale it up slightly. And we should even be able to do a transition. If I remember correctly, it's, can I do, what if I just do this actually? Transform. Let's see. It's been a while since I've done these sorts of animations. Okay, there you go. We have some animation, but we can tell that this scaling is too high. We also get these trails for the border. It's not the best, and I'm guessing they stay there for some time. Let's go back to our code and see if we can just maybe reduce that ever so slightly. Let's make it 1.1. Nice, very cool. Actually, let's even, I think if we made it a little more snappy, 0.5 seconds. There you go. So yeah, some just very simple things that we can do just to add some, I guess, better user experience to our website. But anyways, thank you all so much for joining me on this experience today. I had a lot of fun with this one this week. I hope that the new organization helps you all out learning these new technologies. And of course, if you have any questions, please reach out to me via the comment section below or shoot me an email. You can find it on my About section on my channel. But thank you so much. And yeah, we'll follow up with another one next week. I'll pick another random number and we'll see what we land on. Again, hope you all had fun and see you all next time.